All right, so I do have kind of a set of slides um, talking about, I would say, the overall structure of how you can configure Drupal to work with Solr. I feel like at a high level, the same broad principles would probably work if you were trying to use another CMS with Solr. Potentially at some level, using another CMS with another search appliance, because it's really all about understanding how the search application indexes your content and how some of those nuances can impact the relevance of the results. And so I'll try and move through these. If anybody has questions or comments as we move through, I definitely would like to keep this as more of an open conversation. So yeah, let's start diving into site search and relevance and how you can make your content easy to find. Again, it's going to be definitely Drupal focused, but hopefully some of the principles here will apply to other technologies as well. So my name is Martin Anderson Klutz on Drupal.org and various social platforms. I go by Manclue, and I work for a company called Northern, which is in London, Ontario, Canada. So the first thing you may be asking, well, maybe you're not asking since you came out to the session, but is search really that important? And the answer is that for a lot of users, search is definitely at a minimum the fallback strategy. So people may come to your site and not really be able to parse, your navigation, and rather than sort of try and muddle their way through something that maybe they don't have the domain knowledge to understand because it's very technical, they may just default to search to try and find what they're looking for. They may also be people who have come to your site before and they know there's something there, but they can't remember how to find it. Or it may be that they had come to your site as part of an earlier step of the buying process, and now they've come back and want to transact, but don't want to have to sort of, again, work their way through the navigation to find that product that now they're ready to buy. And so being able to have search as an effective tool to connect those people with the things that they're looking for is actually pretty important. So this tweet a little while back, and I thought it was pretty relevant to this discussion. So, if a person can't find what they need from your site, for them, it's as if that content isn't there. And so you can put a lot of effort into building, a really compelling set of content, into building a product page that has, clear call to action and, do all those good things. But if people can't find those things on your website, then to them, it's as if that content doesn't exist. And so as much as IA is important, also having effective search as a way that people can find that content is going to be really, really important for you. So specifically, we're going to talk about Search API as you would configure it to interact with Solr. And the first place we're going to talk about is how you configure your fields to be indexed for Solr. So that I think a really fundamental principle to understand is that there are kind of a couple of different sort of data types in terms of how Solr is going to index the content. And so anything that's full text, or there are, I would say, different kinds of full text indexing of fields, but all of the full text versions are the ones that are actually being indexed for relevance. So when somebody types in keywords, those are the fields that Solr is using to tell whether what they're looking for is related to a particular piece of content. String or integer fields typically will not be counted towards relevance, but instead towards more faceting or filtering type of uses within Solr. So to be able to say, I want to be able to see all content related to this topic, but then relevant to these keywords. It's basically mutually exclusive, but as you're configuring your Search API configuration, you have the ability to index a field more than once. So you can say, index it as full text so that it counts towards relevance, but potentially also index that same field in a different way so that I can use it as a facet. So that's an important distinction to understand. And within that interface, there's actually this data types collapsible field set that gives you some information about the different data types and how they're used by Solr and so on. So even directly within the Search API interface, there's this information that can be useful to you. So by all means, check that out. The other thing that you're really going to want to do is to make sure that you boost the fields that are most likely to help people connect to the most important information. So oftentimes you'll see the title of content be something that gets boosted higher. If your site is product focused, then the SKU may be something that you want to really boost, so that if somebody puts in a SKU field, that an exact match there is going to pop that product directly to the top. And so there's no sort of single answer, but again, it's the boost is definitely a way that you can say matches in particular fields are the way that we're going to tell Solr how to prioritize basically different fields for relevance. So yeah, we've got title and SKU there, but depending on the nature of your site and what kind of content you're getting indexed, that answer will vary in terms of how things should be boosted. So here's an example of some fields, and you can see here we've got full text unstemmed, and this is what the dropdown looks like in terms of being able to weight things. So essentially, the higher the number, the more Solr is going to count that towards relevance, and you can also use sort of something less than 1 to say that's really less relevant. There's actually no negative counting towards relevance. But also there's potentially this distinction here between full text and full text unstemmed. So particularly newer versions of Solr will use a stemming strategy. And so that's basically a way of saying, if the word being indexed is swim or swimmer or swimming, to reduce all of those down to that common stem of swim. And so when somebody searches, if they search for any keyword that's, again, swim or swimmer or swimming, it'll match it up to any of those words that have that common stem. So it's a way to connect things up and be sort of a bit more, I'm not sure if fault tolerance is the right word, but to sort of provide better matching strategies, understanding that those things have sort of a common concept. One of the things that you can do in more recent versions of Search API is to actually, instead of indexing field by field, you can say index the rendered HTML output. And particularly as Drupal has more complex ways of defining content, this can be a huge time saver. So instead of having to work out some very detailed way of making sure that all of your paragraphs get indexed, or all of the different things within a layout builder, all of the custom blocks and all of those things get indexed properly, to be able to say, hey, Search API, just take the output of the page and index that, and then you can still layer on top of that individual fields, let's say if you want to use them for faceting or some of those other things. But to be able to just say, take the rendered HTML output and index that, I think a lot of times is going to be a pretty effective strategy in terms of making sure that the text of the page that a user is going to see when they go to a page is actually what gets indexed. And it's good in the sense that there's a pretty good correlation between what's being indexed and what they're going to see if they click on that search result and get there. It does give you a loss of ability to potentially tune relevance per field. So again, you may, if there are specific fields that you think should be boosted, then you could do the rendered HTML output as well as individually index particular fields. And so here's what that looks like. So on a like per content type or per bundle, if you're indexing things beyond content. So if you're indexing also, let's say, taxonomy terms, then per vocabulary, you'd be able to do some of these things. But you can choose which view mode for your content you want to be indexed. And I think the thing that's maybe kind of important to understand here is that View modes in Drupal have a fallback strategy. So if you say use, full content or search index as what you want to be indexed, if that isn't defined for a specific content type, it will actually use default as a fallback strategy. And so you could set everything to search index, and then only on content types where you actually need to do something more custom in terms of what gets indexed. You can actually implement that as a defined view mode for that content type, and then make changes in terms of what fields are displaying. For example, if for whatever reason you wanted there are fields that you wanted to get indexed that aren't necessarily displayed if you go and look at a particular node. In terms of referenced entities, so for example, if you have a set of events and you have on there a taxonomy for event type, if you index that field, it's important to know that typically what will be indexed is actually the ID of the taxonomy term or whatever the related entity is by default. And so when you display that result, or it gets pulled out into the search results, if you use that in a facet, it's actually using the ID. Drupal is pretty good about being able to convert that back to a label, for example, in the facets. But if you want that to count towards relevance, then you sort of need to do some extra work. And what you can do is actually add a field that is basically the related taxonomy terms name, as an example. Or if you wanted to do, if it was locations and you wanted to index, for whatever reason, the related to your event, the location's address, you could use this kind of an interface where you can drill down into your related content and pick specific fields from it and have those indexed, and then either use that for facets or for full text. Again, it's all about how you define that field within Search API, and that will dictate how it can be used once you pull that result into Drupal. So that was what I wanted to cover as far as kind of the Search API and how it uses fields. Does anybody have any questions or comments, things that they're doing differently with fields in Search API, or like problems they've run into?
I had a question on the unstemmed.
Okay.
So does that mean that if I say unstemmed, does that mean if someone types in swimming, it'll find things that have the words swim, or is it the other way around?
So it's actually the other way around. So if you do unstemmed, then it has to be more of an exact match.
Okay.
I find unstemmed can actually be really useful if you want to provide a highlight, because by default it'll stem as it indexes, and so when you show the highlight, it's actually applied the stemming and reduced those down, and then it'll look kind of funky because it doesn't like read properly as English anymore, right? And so sometimes what I'll do is make a copy and set the I think I get into this later on, but there's yeah. So if you do an index of the same content, but index it as unstemmed and use that for the highlight, then it actually will kind of read better in your search results.
Okay. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, no problem.
I have a question on the date, how to add dates to index, but maybe it will be later on.
Good question. So you're talking about for sort of like filtering on dates?
Yep.
So let's actually go back. Go back here. In here. So Solr actually has a data type of date, and so if you wanted to, let's say, use the Drupal created time as the thing that you want to filter on, then you would want to make sure that you get that indexed as a date, and then you'd be able to use that for faceting or filtering in your results. I believe there's at least one module that is meant to provide kind of a range for facets, but I will confess that I'm not sure I've personally use that combination together. So your mileage may vary in terms of how well those two work together, but I would say making sure that you're using the date data type is going to be your best bet in terms of being able to use that as a filter.
Okay, because yeah, I think that the range is kind of where we have been challenged a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like it's another one of those modules that worked pretty well in Drupal 7, but because it's not as commonly used, it's had some challenges in terms of getting to a stable release in Drupal 8/9. So
Got it. Thank you.
yeah, welcome. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so let's talk for a minute about processors. So the fields is really about telling Search API what should be passed on to the search engine. So, you know, what should go into Solr in this case. But processors are your opportunity to modify how that goes in. So are there certain ways that you want to sort of translate or manipulate that data as it goes off to that search engine? So an example of one that's pretty common is the HTML filter. So you can say, strip out all of the HTML tags because we don't want the tags themselves to in any way interfere with any of how that content is being indexed for relevance, and also to potentially prevent sort of like phrase matches. So let's say you've got a phrase match and it matches content, part of which is inside like a strong tag or something. If you haven't stripped out that HTML, then it may not match it to that same degree. And so the HTML filter is basically saying, Solr, understand that as text. But it also gives you some options in terms of being able to boost specific tags within that content as it gets indexed. So if we look in here, you can see you can do things like say, also on images, index the titles or the alt attributes, and you can also boost specific tags. So you could say, if something is an H1 within our content, let's boost it by a factor of 5. If it's an H2 and so on. Hopefully you're not using B tags in 2021, but there you go. And so if there are, like pull quotes, whatever markup you might know that you have in your content, you have the opportunity to add boost to say, by nature of the fact that, a match might be in a heading or some other kind of element to give that a higher sense of relevance within the overall results. You can also strip out characters. So if it's pretty common, people may search for something that in the text of the document where it might appear would have an apostrophe S, but for the sake of doing a search on their mobile, they'll just ignore any punctuation and do the search that way. And so you want to make sure that you try and strip those out so that the matching of those kind of words is not going to be tripped up by being too specific in terms of matching based on punctuation and other kind of special characters. You also have the ability to do kind of transliteration. So it's pretty common, up in Canada where I live, there's lots of French language users, but particularly on mobile, they're not going to go through the effort of putting accented characters into site search. So you definitely want to make sure that you use transliteration to basically index in a way that strips out all of the accented characters and does the same on any queries so that whether or not the accent is actually used in either the query or the indexed content doesn't sort of, again, prevent a match. And so here's what that looks like in terms of sort of the ignored characters. Usually I use the default values, but be interested to hear if people have other experiences in terms of specific manipulations they've had to do to adjust that. You can also use the highlight processor to display an excerpt of result text. So it's similar to the way Google oftentimes in its search results, particularly if a site has not defined kind of a description meta tag, it'll actually pull sections of the text out that seem to have the highest match relevance to the provided keywords. This is basically getting Solr to do the same thing. And you can actually, within the processor, define what markup it's going to use around the matches. So I think by default it'll use strong, but if you wanted something else, you have the ability to customize that. So yeah, we talked earlier about how the highlight, sometimes if you're using a stemmed version of the full text indexing, can make the output of the highlight a little bit not what you would expect. And so using a full text unstemmed as the field to use for the highlighting can help to prevent that and make it look more like what the actual content would be when somebody sort of clicks through to the end result. So here's what the configuration for that looks like. You can define the length of the excerpt. You can have the defined sort of the tags that are going to be used around that. I mean, potentially you could have more than one, I suppose, based on that. But again, I feel like a lot of organizations want something that's sort of Google-like in terms of how the results are formatted, and I find this does a pretty decent job. It's also important to know that there are parse modes that you can, different parse modes that you can use in terms of having Drupal work with Solr. It's a bit unintuitive in the sense that this part of the configuration is actually in the view for showing results, as opposed to being something that's part of kind of how you set up the server or the index. So the default that it uses is actually pretty fault tolerant. But it strips out a lot of the characters that you would want to use for search modifiers. So using a plus to basically force the inclusion of a particular keyword, or a minus to say don't include things that have a match to this particular keyword. You can use the direct query parse mode to allow some of those modifiers, but then it's much easier for people to accidentally construct a query that's basically going to break and not give them any results at all, even though it's really more around how they've, let's say, set up those modifiers, as opposed to there not actually being content that's relevant to what they're trying to find. You can also use concepts like fuzziness or sloppiness. So fuzziness being if they've misspelled one of the words, to say, let's basically do fuzzy matching on the actual word. Sloppiness is more for like phrase type matching, to say the keywords can be apart by so much and still consider that basically a phrase match. And it's worth noting that if you want to play around with these in the views configuration for that, there is some information that it'll give you. So let's look at that. So this is in the full text search configuration within the views UI. And you can see here are all of the different options for the parse mode. And then when you make a selection, it'll actually give you this information below in terms of helping you to understand what those differences are. And hopefully that'll give you some guidance in terms of which one you think is going to be best suited for your use case. So that was the processors, and I guess maybe parse modes is sort of snuck in there. But again, it's all about sort of how the content is manipulated going into Solr, and I guess parse modes being sort of some of the ways that you can manipulate how Solr sort of searches and returns results. So any questions, comments, challenges people have run into for any of those?
Hi, Martin. I think this last slide was directly related to something I was going to ask you about. I have a case where somebody types in something like thinking different, and I want to match if it has both of those words, right? So I sort of have it anded together. But I also want to have more relevance if they have that exact phrase. So does that mean that I would take this parse mode and apply sloppiness, or I was a little unsure which one of these I'd want to do in that case.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm trying off the top of my head to think back to how these parse modes map to the actual Solr sort of like query strategies, because I know in Solr, I think it's the BF query strategy where you can do things like say do the standard keyword search, but then also almost like use the phrase query match as a way to boost. So to say, we'll take anything that matches those two keywords. So almost more of like a standard multiple words match,
Right.
but then also give a boost to anything that also has like more of the direct phrase match. So it's less of like, because I feel like the single phrase is going to be very strict in the sense of saying like, if those two words are together on a piece of content, or like they're both on a piece of content but not together, then they may not show up as a result for like the single phrase match. And there are definitely Solr ways to do more of the, I think what you're saying is like treat it like a keyword search, but make sure anything that has a phrase match is at the top of those results. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So I think I might try multiple words with sloppiness. Phrase search with sloppiness might be another one to try, but you're probably going to need to play around with them.
Experiment a bit.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure 100%, but I know in views you can enable the query. I'm not 100% sure if like on a search view if it'll show you what it's actually querying Solr, but if turning on the debugging does show you that, then you can potentially use that to see with these parse modes what it's actually generating is like a Solr query, and then look at the Solr documentation to potentially see like maybe edismax is the way you want to go, and that's the way to construct things potentially. Like I know you can also do, obviously, like there's search API Solr query alter that if you want to get like really custom, you can sort of inject some things to do in kind of more hardcore customization of like exactly how that gets passed over to Solr.
Is there, it sounds like there's a way you were saying to sort of get debug information about.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we could try it here. So let's go into views. Let's go in our settings. So show the SQL query is what I was thinking of. And then if we go back to our list and do search, challenge here being, might have to do, see here. Okay, so here's what that looks like for Search API Solr.
I see, and so it has this parsed keys piece.
Yeah, so it gives you some detail. It's maybe not the exact query string that got passed over to Solr, but hopefully that's at least partially useful.
Okay, thanks, Martin.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions before we move on?
I have a question on, I'm not sure whether I'm using correct terminology. So when you're doing a search, you're showing snippets, excerpts.
Right.
And I'm not exactly clear how it is pulling experts and where it is pulling from.
All right. Okay, so let me go back. Try cancel results. So let's go. So this is what the excerpt looks like. And it's what it's doing is it's taking all of the content that's indexed for each of these pieces of content. So if we go in here, we can see all of the content that's in here. And what it's doing is it's saying for the search term, the keyword that we've passed in 0, it's going to basically parse through all of this and try and pull out sections of it that match our keyword. And so you can see in here, it's returning all of these pieces. And based on this being configured to use the default sort of strong markup, it's bolding wherever that keyword appears within this highlight that it's generated.
So if this content, if this keyword is inside one of the fields, it will bring snippet from the field, right?
Right. That would be included in the excerpt because this is doing that rendered HTML. So it's basically taking all of the page as it would appear to a user and indexing all of that for search.
Okay. This rendered HTML is another thing that I'll have to figure out how to do, but yeah, this is great. This is awesome.
Okay, great. Any other questions? All right, so the next section is really around saying, hopefully we have good strategies for doing fairly reliable indexing of results to give sort of what I would almost call like organic relevance, to say these are the things that naturally correspond to a particular query. But sometimes on a site, we want to be able to give, let's say, the editor or the site administrator some ways to boost a particular piece of content. So let's say for whatever reason, a particular piece of content doesn't have a lot of body text, but the let's say it has an attachment that has a lot of good relevance, and we know that particular attachment is the thing that people should see as the top result. But generally speaking, across the website, we've set the attachment as a lower priority in terms of content. So how, as a site administrator, could I have the ability to say, I want that thing to appear at the top of the results? So in general, one strategy is type-specific boosting. So you can say, I want this content type to always rank a bit higher for things where it's relevant. So if your site was all about, well, if you had an e-commerce site, you might say, I want products to appear above, FAQ content as an example, right? I want people to be directed more towards the things that they can transact and buy. So obviously, which content you're going to boost is going to depend on your individual site and which content you see as more key to people who come into your site. But the benefit is that this is something that's really built into recent builds of Search API Solr, and so it's pretty easy to configure. So you can enable this type-specific boosting, and then for each of your content types or other bundles, you basically use the same. You can either leave it at the default, which is, I think, kind of like 1, or you can boost particular content types or de-emphasize them by setting a value less than 1. There are also strategies for boosting recent content. So you can say, let's say you have a news site. You would say, all other things being equal, I want the more recent content to rank higher. And Solr definitely supports that. It's a bit more complicated in Drupal. The last time I checked, you have to kind of write some custom code. Basically, I think it's a custom processor. And there's a couple of articles here in terms of how to make that happen. So maybe not for the faint of heart, certainly not kind of a drop-in solution, but possible. Another strategy that we've used a few times is to basically create kind of like a search keywords field. So it's, let's say, a text area or multiple value field, text field, where you basically say, editors, if you have certain fields where, or certain keywords where you want this piece of content to rank higher, you can definitely put those in. The other kind of use case for this strategy is, let's say you have terms that you know your users are coming to your site and looking for, but for whatever reason, you know, corporately, you're not allowed to call this thing the thing that everybody, you know, in the industry actually calls it. So maybe there's like almost like a casual thing, or maybe it's like a legal compliance thing that you have to refer to, let's say, this type of product as, you know, an insurance asset, but everybody else calls it like, you know, life insurance policy. You could use something like this to basically say, index it high against the thing that we know people are calling it, even though as an organization, we're not allowed to call it that. So it can sort of fit those two use cases of basically boosting something, or also saying, make this rank against something, even though we're not allowed to actually use that in the content or what have you. Thing to understand about this strategy is that it's good for boosting, but you can't actually say, never show this as a result for that thing, right? So it's only kind of like a boost strategy, but not an exclusion strategy. And so this is what that might look like. Again, instead of it being a multi-value text field, it could be a text area, and then you can just parse that again as full text. It's fairly simple setup. Just make sure it gets indexed, and then also that it doesn't display on the actual content display. And then I think the last one we're going to talk about in this section is there's actually a module called search overrides that allows you to provide basically interface even, so there you can manage them as entities, or you can actually manage them directly within your kind of like node interface to say, for specific content, you know, promote this piece of content or exclude it from other queries. And then the other option that it gives you is to not only say which pieces of content should rank higher, but also to manually set that ranking. So to say, I want these 3 pieces of content to be 1, 2, 3 as the top 3 search results, which is something that I'm not sure that any other, at least Drupal-based strategy, really gives you that level of control. I can probably demo this later on if we still have time and anybody wants to see it. Any questions, comments around that sort of manipulation section in terms of like things that people wanted but couldn't achieve, or they've tried one of these and it didn't work, or it was great, or any sort of questions or comments there? Seems like we're good. I'll keep moving. So one thing I would encourage you to think of in terms of relevance is that it's a process and not a destination. Actually, I think if you were in my earlier session about usability, I think I probably said the same thing about usability, but it's probably true for a lot of things related to a website. So don't think of relevance as a thing that you set up and then assume everything is going to be golden and people are never going to have problems finding things in search and you can walk away. Really, there should be an ongoing process. I would say, personally, I would say at a minimum quarterly, but ideally more like monthly. Do things like look in your analytics and see what are the most popular search queries that are being performed on your website. If you have some kind of a subject matter expert who can actually run that query themselves, and then look at those results and then maybe say, you know, those look fine, or maybe they would say, you know what, the thing that probably most people are going to find most useful right now is showing up as like number 8. And then at that point, you want to look at, I would say, if you can solve some of those challenges more algorithmically, so like maybe you just need to change which fields are being boosted by how much, that's going to fix things more broadly. But there may be some cases where, for whatever reason, just one piece of content is this like weird unicorn thing, and you need to just use one of those manipulation strategies. Within your analytics, abandoned searches can be a good metric to see. Again, with those most popular queries, you may say, you know, these are the top 5 most popular, but, you know, number 3 has a search abandonment rate that's like, you know, 5 times the rest of them. So that's definitely the one that we want to dig into first and figure out, you know, what's the thing that people are looking for that they can't find when they run that search. You may also find value in thinking about, are there context-specific searches? So, you know, again, the idea of an e-commerce website, you may have a more targeted version of search that's actually just around products. And then you've got a different facet configuration to help people find, different kinds of products based on sort of, key parameters of the types of products that you offer. FAQ knowledge base, it would be another good example of saying, there's a very specific kind of content. We may want to use a different parsing mode for FAQ type knowledge base because we know it's probably less around looking for specific parameters as maybe answering more of a natural language question. Or, within higher education, a program finder is definitely a very common use case. And so if you can do that as a Solr search and then maybe map, facets to, some of the degrees or, career outcomes or some of those other kinds of things that people may be using, that can be a really powerful way to use your Solr search. So that was really the content that I brought. I think that's actually pretty decent as far as time, but definitely happy to have some open discussion. As I say, if anybody wanted to see how that search API or search overrides works, we could definitely look at that, but happy to open it up for discussion.
Well, first, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, people feel free to put it in chat or unmute yourself and ask. And if people don't have questions, I'm going to ask my question. Let's see if someone else wants to ask something else.
I just wanted to mention that I think there's going to be a wrap up in the community room.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrea.
Right. I guess that'd be like in 2 minutes.
Yes. I have a quick question. So if we have text files like PDF files, doc files attached both via files or in media library, what are tips and tricks to make text in this file searchable?
So there is a Search API attachments module
Attachments
that you can use to index the content of those related documents. That works pretty well depending on hosting. You may need to either, with older versions of Solr, oftentimes to get that work, you would need to have almost like a sister library to Solr called Tika. As the program that would basically parse that file and extract out the text, sort of similar to how we talked about with the HTML filter of sort of like getting the text out of the markup.
Yeah.
In the same way, Tika can parse through, PDFs or XLS or Word documents. I think it's like, I want to say at least dozens, maybe hundreds of different formats that it can actually parse and extract out all of that content. But I'm pretty sure
Tika,
in more recent,
okay, Apache Tika library, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can include that in basically your Drupal code base, and then in the Search API attachments configuration, you can point it to where the Tika library is, and then it will use that for doing extraction. In more recent versions of Solr, it actually has those same capabilities in Solr, and so you can point Search API attachments to use Solr, and in my experience that works pretty well too. So it sort of depends on, if you're using Acquia hosting, I know they recently updated their Solr, so you should be able to at least try using the Solr extraction, and if that doesn't work, then use Tika as a fallback is what I would say.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering if there's a big difference between Elasticsearch and Solr attachment approach.
So Elasticsearch is sort of a completely different search appliance to Solr, right? So you'd be using either Solr or Elasticsearch typically. Elasticsearch, is definitely a very capable search appliance, and lots of people use it and have great results. I would say from a Drupal standpoint, there's definitely better support built into Drupal for Solr.
Mhm.
So for a Drupal site, all other things being equal, I would probably say lean towards Solr just because of that community support.
Mhm.
But as I say, there are lots of people getting great results from Elasticsearch. So if that's, you know, the features of that map better to what you're trying to do, then by all means, you know, forge ahead on that, and hopefully that works out well for you.